A Shadow of the Past is the first episode of the first season of the American fantasy television series The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, based on the novel The Lord of the Rings and its appendices by J.R.R. Tolkien. Set in the Second Age of Middle-earth, thousands of years before Tolkien's The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, it follows a large cast as they face the re-emergence of evil. The episode was written by showrunners J.D. Payne and Patrick McKay, and directed by J.A. Bayona. Amazon made a multi-season commitment for a new The Lord of the Rings series in November 2017. Payne and McKay were set to develop it in July 2018, and Bayona was hired to direct the first 2 episodes a year later. The first episode introduces some of the key characters, relationships, and groups for the series, such as Morfydd Clark's Galadriel. Her characterization is depicted differently from The Lord of the Rings and was shaped by Tolkien's notes on the character's backstory. Harfoots, precursors to the popular Hobbit race from The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, are also introduced to the series in the episode. Filming for the first season began in New Zealand in February 2020, but was placed on hold in March due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Production resumed in September and wrapped for the first 2 episodes by the end of December. A Shadow of the Past premiered on the streaming service Prime Video on September 1, 2022. Along with the second episode, it had the most viewers of any Prime Video premiere within 24 hours, and received generally positive reviews. Fictional biography. Stories of Galadriel's life prior to the War of the Ring appear in both the Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales. She was the only daughter and youngest child of Finarfin, Prince of the Noldor, and of Irwen, daughter of Olwe and cousin to Luthien. Her elder brothers were Finrod Felagund, Angrod, and Aenir. She was born in Valinor. She had the ability to peer into the minds of others to judge them fairly. She was a member of the royal house of Finwë. Galadriel was often called the fairest of all elves, whether in Aman or Middle-earth. According to the older account of her story, sketched by Tolkien in The Road Goes Ever On and used in the Silmarillion, Galadriel was an eager participant and leader in the rebellion of the Noldor and their flight from Valinor. She was the only female to stand tall in those days. She had, however, long since parted ways with Fëanor and his sons. In Beleriand she lived with her brother Finrod Felagund at Nargothrond and the court of Thingol and Melian in Doriath. In this account, she met Celeborn, a kinsman of Thingol, in Doriath. She carried some dark secrets from those times. She told Melian part of the violent story of the Silmarils and Morgoth's killing of Finwë, but did not mention the kinslaying of elves by elves. Second Age. Galadriel and Celeborn travelled first to Lindon, where they ruled over a group of elves, and were themselves ruled by Gil-galad. According to Concerning Galadriel and Celeborn, they then removed to the shores of Lake Nanul and were accounted the lord and lady of all the elves of Eriador. Later, they moved eastward and established the realm of Eregion. They made contact with an Andoran settlement in the valley of the river Anduin, which became Lothlorien. At some point, Celeborn and Galadriel left Eregion and settled in Lothlorien. According to some of Tolkien's accounts, they became rulers of Lothlorien for a time during the Second Age, but in all accounts they returned to Lorien to take up its rule after Amroth was lost in the middle of the Third Age. Celeborn and Galadriel had a daughter, Celebrian, who married Elrond half-elven of Rivendell. During the Second Age, when the Rings of Power were forged, Galadriel distrusted Annatar, the lore master who taught the craft of the rings to Celebrimbor. Again, according to some of the accounts, Celebrimbor rebelled against her view and seized power in Eregion. As a result, Galadriel departed to Lorien via the gates of Moria, but Celeborn refused to enter the dwarves' stronghold and stayed behind. Her distrust was justified, for Annatar turned out to be the Dark Lord, Sauron. When Sauron attacked Eregion, Celebrimbor entrusted Galadriel with Nina, one of the 3 rings of the elves. Sealborn joined up with Elrond, whose force was unable to relieve Eregion but managed to escape back to Imladris. Sealborn reunited with Galadriel when the war ended. According to one text, after some years in Imladris, Galadriel's sea longing became so strong that the couple removed to Belfalas and lived at the place later called Dol Amroth. Third Age. In the Fellowship of the Ring, Galadriel welcomed the Fellowship to Lothlorien after their escape from Moria. When she met the Fellowship in her tree dwelling, she gave each member a searching look, testing their resolve, though Boromir interpreted this test as a temptation. She was in turn tested when Frodo Baggins offered to place the ring in her keeping. Knowing that its corrupting influence would make her great and terrible, and recalling the ambitions that had once brought her to Middle-earth, she refused the ring. She accepted that her own ring's power would fail, that her people would diminish and fade with the One Ring's destruction, and that her only escape from the fading of the elves and the dominion of men would be to return at last to Valinor. It is implied, backed up by other writings, that in acknowledgement of this renunciation of power her personal ban from Valinor was lifted. When the Fellowship left Lothlorien, she gave each member a gift and an elven cloak, and furnished the party with supplies, both as practical support and as a symbol of faith, hope and goodwill. Her husband Sealborn likewise provided the Fellowship with elven boats. On the day that the Fellowship left Lorien, but unknown to them, Gandalf arrived, carried by the eagle Gwaihir. Galadriel healed his wounds and reclothed him in white, signaling his new status as head of the Istari, the Order of Wizards. After Sauron perished, Sealborn led the host of Lorien across the Anduin and captured Dol Guldur. Galadriel came forth and threw down its walls and laid bare its pits. She travelled to Minas Tirith for the wedding of her granddaughter Arwen to King Aragorn Elessar after the end of the war. Galadriel passed over the Great Sea with Elrond, Gandalf, and the ring-bearers Bilbo and Frodo, marking the end of the Third Age. Sealborn remained behind, and Tolkien writes that there is no record of the day when at last he sought the Grey Havens. Characteristics. The Dunedain said that her height was 2 Ranjar, or man-high, some 6 feet 4 inches. However, Galadriel's most striking feature was her beautiful long silver golden hair. The elves of Tirion said it captured the radiance of the two trees Laurelin and Telperion themselves. Even among the Eldar she was accounted beautiful, and her hair is held a marvel unmatched. It is golden like the hair of her father and of her foremother Indies, but richer and more radiant, for its gold is touched by some memory of the star-like silver of her mother, and the Eldar say that the light of the two trees, Laurelin and Telperion, has been snared in her tresses. Fëanor greatly admired her hair, it may have inspired him to create the Silmarils. Many thought that this saying first gave to Fëanor the thought of imprisoning and blending the light of the trees that later took shape in his hands as the Silmarils. For Fëanor beheld the hair of Galadriel with wonder and delight. Nevertheless, Galadriel never repaid Fëanor's admiration. Fëanor had begged her thrice for a tress and thrice she refused to give him even one hair. It is said that these two kinsfolk, being considered the greatest of the Eldar of Valinor, remain unfriends forever. Her character was a blend of characteristics of the Eldar from whom she was descended. She had the pride and ambition of the Noldor, but in her they were tempered by the gentleness and insight of the Vanyar. She shared the latter virtues of character with her father Finarfin and her brother Finrod. She was proud, strong, and self-willed, as were all the descendants of Finwë save Finarfin, and like her brother Finrod, of all her kin the nearest to her heart, she had dreams of far lands and dominions that might be her own to order as she would without tutelage. Yet deeper still there dwelt in her the noble and generous spirit of the Vanyar, and a reverence for the Vala that she could not forget. From her earliest years she had a marvelous gift of insight into the minds of others, but judged them with mercy and understanding, and she withheld her goodwill from none save only Fëanor. In him she perceived a darkness that she hated and feared, though she did not perceive that the shadow of the same evil had fallen upon the minds of all the Noldor, and upon her own. Her sympathy for Gimli the dwarf in Lothlorien completely won him over. Relationships. Analysis. Reconstructed Old English elf. The critic Tom Shippey notes that in creating Galadriel, Tolkien was attempting to reconstruct the kind of elf hinted at by elf references in Old English words. The hints are, he observes, paradoxical, while Ylfseen, elf beautiful, suggests a powerful allure, Ylfsogoa, lunacy, implies that getting too close to elves is dangerous. In Shippey's view, Tolkien is telling the literal truth that beauty is itself dangerous, as Chaucer did in The Wife of Bath's Tale, where both elves and friars are sexually rapacious. So when Faramir says to Sam Gamgee in Ithilien that Galadriel must be perilously fair, Shippey comments that this is a highly accurate remark. Sam replies that folk takes their peril with them into Lorien. But perhaps you could call her perilous, because she's so strong in herself. Angelic being. Shippey also considers the Christian Middle English attitude of the South English legendary, a hagiographic work which he supposes Tolkien must have read, that elves were angels. In Shippey's view, Tolkien's elves are much like fallen angels, above men but below the angelic Maer and the godlike Vala. He comments at once that Galadriel is in one way certainly not fallen, as the elves avoided the war on Melkor in the First Age, but all the same, Galadriel has been expelled from a kind of heaven, the deathless land of Valinor, and has been forbidden to return. Shippey suggests that the men of Middle-earth might have thought the fall of Melkor and the expulsion of Galadriel added up to a similar fallen status, and he praises Tolkien for taking both sides of the story of elves into account. Arthurian figure. The Tolkien scholar Marjorie Burns compares Galadriel to Rider Haggard's heroine Aisha in his 1887 novel She, A History of Adventure, a book that Tolkien acknowledged as an important influence, and to Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott, which recast the Arthurian legend of Elaine of Astolat. She notes that Aisha was herself an Arthurian figure, transposed to 19th-century Africa. Homeric benefactor. The Tolkien scholar Mac Fenwick compares Galadriel and what he sees as her monstrous opposite, the giant and evil spider Shelob, with the struggle between the good and the monstrous female characters in Homer's Odyssey. Like Galadriel, Circe and Calypso are rulers of their own secluded magical realms, and both offer help and advice to the protagonist. They help Odysseus to avoid destruction by the female monsters, the sirens who would lure his ship onto the rocks, and Scylla and Charybdis who would smash or drown his ship. Galadriel gives Frodo the Phial of Galadriel, which by her power contains the light of Arundel's star, able to blind and ward off Shelob in her darkest of dark lairs. Galadriel's gifts, too, are Homeric, including cloaks, food, and wisdom as well as light, just like those of Circe and Calypso. Legacy in music. Tolkien wrote a poem Naimari that Galadriel sings in farewell to the departing fellowship, and to Frodo in particular. The song is in Quenya, and spoke of things little known in Middle-earth, but Frodo is said to have remembered the words and translated them long afterward. It is a lament in which Galadriel describes her separation from the Blessed Realm and the Vala, her longing to return there, and at the end a wish or hope that even though she herself is forbidden to return, that Frodo might somehow come in the end to the city of Valimar in Valinor. The poem was set to music by Donald Swann with Tolkien's assistance. The sheet music and an audio recording are part of the song cycle of The Road Goes Ever On. In a recording, Tolkien sings it in the style of a Gregorian chant. On their album Once Again, the band Barclay James Harvest featured a song called Galadriel. It gained notability because guitarist John Lees played John Lennon's Epiphone Casino guitar on this track, an event later recounted in a song on the band's 1990 album Welcome to the Show titled John Lennon's Guitar. Hank Marvin and John Ferrer wrote a song Galadriel, recorded by Cliff Richard, The 4 5-line stanzas include the couplet Galadriel, spirit of starlight/eagle and dove gave birth to thee. An Australian band named Galadriel released a self-titled album in 1971 which became a highly sought-after collector's item among European progressive rock circles. In 2003, Fran Walsh, Howard Shore, and Annie Lennox Co. wrote the Oscar-winning song Into the West for the closing credits of The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. Originally sung by Lennox, the song was conceived as Galadriel's bittersweet lament for those who have sailed across the sundering seas. The lyrics include phrases from the final chapter of the original novel. The song has since been covered by Julia Townsend and Will Martin. Adaptations. Galadriel was voiced by Annette Crosbie in Ralph Bakshi's 1978 animated film of The Lord of the Rings, and by Marion Diamond in BBC Radio's 1981 serialization. In Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit trilogies, Galadriel is played by Cate Blanchett. In The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, Galadriel narrates the prologue that explains the creation of the One Ring, as well as appearing in Lothlorien. While Galadriel does not feature in Tolkien's The Hobbit, the story was amended so that she could appear in Jackson's films based on the book. On stage, Galadriel was portrayed by Rebecca Jackson Mendoza in the 2006 Toronto musical production of The Lord of the Rings. Mendoza's dress was hand-embroidered with some 1,800 beads. The musical was revised and moved to London's Theatre Royal, Drury Lane in 2007, with Laura Michelle Kelly in the glittering role. Galadriel appears in video games such as The Lord of the Rings, The Battle for Middle-earth 2, where she is voiced by Lonnie Minella. In the 2022 television series The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power, young Galadriel was portrayed by Morfydd Clark, and her younger version by Amelie Child Villers.